Good morning. Good morning. Welcome. Let's wait to see as folks are joining. Welcome. Good morning and welcome, colleagues, to yet another episode of the Early Childhood Systems, Perspectives and Research webinar series. I'll be a facilitator for today's discussion. I'm Elizabeth Baini, Research Specialist at Ilifa Labantwana. Welcome. If you're joining us for the first time, if you're returning, warmly welcome. So just a little bit about the Early Childhood Systems and Perspectives and Research webinar series. This is a joint initiative of Ilifa Labantwana, our strategic partners at Research on Socio-Economic Policy, RESEP, at Stellenbosch University, and Data Drive 2030. The aim is to explore the latest research and perspective on a range of issues affecting the early childhood development service delivery ecosystem. And we really want to create change for children through promotion of research and data. So welcome. Just a couple of housekeeping. We've got a question and answer tab. If you have any questions as the presentation or discussion is going on, please pop it in there. You can also make use of the chat tab, but ideally we would like you to put it in the question and answer. It makes life a little bit easier. After the presentation, there'll be an opportunity for folks to engage. So feel free to raise your hand to ask a question, comment, add a provocation, and let's keep the conversation alive. So why are we here this morning? Last month, on the 19th of February, we were all expecting the tabling of the 2025 budget, which did not happen, was postponed because of a proposed increase in VAT. Treasury and the finance minister had in their decision a 2 percentage point increase in VAT that was supposedly going to help fund some of the commitments in the 2025 budget. The now withdrawn budget was promising for the ECD sector because ECD was positioned to receive quite a substantial amount and a much needed funding boost, around 10 billion rands in new funding, if we read the documents correctly. While we cannot predict what is in store for ECD in next week's revised budget, we can all agree that any cuts to any part of the ECD budget will be detrimental, it will be retrogressive, and it will erode progress in the sector. So in today's webinar, and probably comes at a really opportune time in the lead up to the revised 2025 budget, we want to discuss and unpack what it means, what the 2025 budget and any austerity measure, budget cuts, cuts on social spending, what that spells out for children's well-being, and obviously for the sector's quest for universal equity, access to quality ECD. And so we'll be looking at a presentation that is exploring the impact of austerity budgeting on South Africa's public services with a unique focus on our sector and everything connected to it. In this morning's conversation, I have the privilege to introduce to you our speaker, Thokozile Madonko, affectionately known to all of us as Toko. So Thokozile Madonko is originally from Zimbabwe, but is based in Cape Town. She is a researcher at the Public Economy Project at Southern Center for Inequality Studies at Wits University. She's also an activist, poet, and climate campaigner, and our very favorite Budget Justice Coalition member and budget advocate. And today we have the privilege of having her help us unpack some of the impact of austerity on children's well-being and the public services broadly. So over to you, Toko. Looking forward to it.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. That was such a lovely introduction, and good morning to everybody. And so pleased to be able to spend the hour with you talking about something that is very, very dear to my my heart. I think it's important for me to just be upfront to say that I will not be talking too much about what was in the non-budget. Because there are a few questions around how that budget was structured and what it was sort of claiming to be. And so I'm really going to focus on the research that the Southern Center for Inequality Studies, my program, the Public Economy Project, in particular, Professor Michael Sachs has been doing on trying to unpack what overall the budget looks like. So I'm going to take you through a little bit around a little bit on budgeting, because you know, it's important to understand what is the purpose of the government budget, and then I'll take you through a little bit about what the budget looks like, and then some pointers on austerity budgeting, and finally a little touch on what could be some of the solutions. And I'm drawing on extensive research on this. And so if you're interested, I can share some of the readings, the literature, and so forth. I've asked Elizabeth to give me a 5-minute check-in. So she's been given strict instructions to rudely interrupt me at the 5-minute mark to make sure I don't go over time. So I want to just start off to say that the South African budget process, you know, the government's money is the people's money. We often, you know, we take this for granted, and it's from the people for the people. And so this makes it a political exercise. So often we get told it's a highly technical exercise. The minister in his presentation after the non-budget said, you know, we don't open up the budget for public deliberation. Well, that's crazy, because it is a political exercise, and it starts with political choices and ends with political choices about which programs and projects get funded. And so that's why we're here. We want to be able to have an understanding of the process itself. And Elizabeth talked about the early childhood fiscal ecosystem. We also look at the fiscal ecosystem, sort of how does it all, who are the power players, who makes the decisions, how are those decisions reached. And so we comment on, by monitoring government's actions, we comment on policies and plans and challenging them to make sure that they're rights-based, equitable, sustainable, and just. And so, you know, it's absolutely critical that we push back on this assumption that people should not participate in the lead up to the budget process. And in fact, there was work done with National Treasury to try and open up the budget process to engage with civil society prior to the tabling. And that's well within Treasury's ambit, and it should happen. Like any other piece of legislation, the budget is a money bill. It should have public participation processes in the lead up to being tabled. And then the parliamentary public process takes over once it's tabled. So why should we focus on economic policy? So what is it? What am I talking about? What do I focus on? I focus on macroeconomic policy as opposed to microeconomic policy, which is very important. But I look at the big picture money story. And it's the use of monetary and fiscal policy, so budget policy, to achieve economy-wide objectives. So this is why a government budget is not like a household budget, because the government's budget can effect change in the economy. It can stimulate sectors. It can print its own money. It can, support green shoots and innovative, sort of startup kind of pieces of activity and industrial activity and so forth. So the government has a role to play in the economy, and it influences the economy. And so it's not the same as a household budget. It's a very different creature. Monetary policy, which I'm not going to focus on today, but I could come back and talk a little bit about, is typically conducted by the Reserve Bank. And as we know, the Reserve Bank talks about its ambit is around interest rates, financial regulation, and inflation targeting. And it's critical for us to talk about monetary policy because it does influence the economy-wide objectives, and it has a huge impact on early childhood development programs and the early childhood ecosystem when you're talking about the cost of goods and services for the provision of services to children. So it is important for us to understand, but I'm not going to focus on that today. We don't have the time. What I am focusing on is on fiscal policy, which is determined by government and covers public expenditure, taxation, and borrowing. So we look at the whole picture around how do we spend money in the economy, how do we tax, so what is the redistribution that who covers the burden. So the value-added tax was a huge issue because it raised questions about who bears the burden of taxation and redistribution. And also then what about debt? But we don't talk about the budget in a vacuum. We always the starting point is always with policy and planning, and that's why we have the State of the Nation address, address before we have the tabling of the budget, because we want to understand what is the policy, what is the purpose, what are we wanting to do with our resources, and what have we decided as a country that we want to see where those resources are going. And so we have the Constitution, which, Section 27 is what is very relevant to our partners today around the right to education and social protection services, and other rights become important, and sets out, the kind of country that we want to be living in. Then the National Development Plan also sets out a number of targets relating to the economy, but also to education as well. And then we have a series of documents that come out, the Medium-Term Strategic Framework, which is now called the Medium-Term Development Plan. It's been renamed. I have not seen the latest version that the president has been referring to. So I am going to talk to the draft version that I have seen. And then we have, a number of conversations within DPME, the Department of Planning, Monitoring, and Evaluation, around what should they see the budget prioritization framework look like, which should then say where we should see our resources flowing to, and how we should be raising money and how we should be spending it. And then I just picked one of the many, 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 many policy frameworks within the early childhood ecosystem. So I looked at the South Africa's 2030 Strategy for Early Childhood Development Program, for example, that also then sets out kind of what needs to be resourced and what the goals are for that. But there are other types of policy. So we always go back to policy. You can't understand the budget if you don't understand the policy. So what the new medium-term development plan, what does it say? So as I've mentioned, this is coming out of the draft documents. I haven't seen the final document. But the president set out that there are three major priorities that are driving fiscal policy, essentially. The priority one is the inclusive growth and job creation. Priority two is to reduce poverty and tackle the high cost of living. And then priority three is a capable, ethical, and developmental state. And so when I'm looking at the budget, I'm assessing whether this budget can deliver on these priorities. But we're also interested in the sector budgets. And so I pulled out what it says about basic education and what it says around early childhood development in particular. And you see it says, continue on program to universalize ECD and continue the program of registering ECD. Sorry, I just need to minimize something. Registering ECD providers. And we also see some mention of eradicating inappropriate school infrastructure, which we know is also relevant to ECD around infrastructure, and infrastructure maintenance as well is relevant. And so hopefully we will get sight of the final medium-term development plan because it guides the next 5 years, and all departments need to align their programming and budgeting to the medium-term development plan. So where do budgets fit into policy making and service delivery? So as I mentioned, that policy is always the starting point. But before that, we have to have an assessment of need. So what is the need? What is the demographic and prevalence data? So South Africa is a highly unequal country. We have high unemployment. We have many, many, many children not in early childhood development, many children that are stunted before the age of 5. So the need is great. And so our policy formulation should be trying to address that need. We then look at the decisions and reached in terms of the policy formation and around costing the programs. If we do this, will we get bang for our buck? Will it be cost effective? How do we assess the impact of these programs and so forth? And then finally, we do the resource allocation and budgeting. And then we have the structures and institutions for implementation. So do we have the right institutions and structures for making sure that we can develop this? Is it something that government does? Do we do it through the private sector, through the nonprofit sector, whatever it might be? Then we have service delivery, then monitoring and evaluation and program impact assessments and financial audit. So the AG comes into play. And all of that can feed back into formulating policy and strategic planning. So that's where the budget fits into the sort of broader story around policy making and service delivery. So the purpose of the budget. So we look at the legislation and the Constitution sets out what we have. We have the 3 spheres of government. Although they are distinctive, the Constitution prescribes cooperative governance and the sharing of revenue raised nationally. And there's provisions for different forms of intervention at a national, at a provincial and local. So it's Section 100 of the Constitution for provinces, Section 139 for local government. And then we have a fiscal institution called the Financial and Fiscal Commission, which sets out in the Constitution, that sets out that its role is to make recommendations and give advice to organs of state on financial and fiscal matters, which is often forgotten. And then we have the Public Finance Management Act at the national and provincial level that sets out financial management and procedures relating to budgeting and budgeting formats and financial management and reporting. So when this non-budget happened, everybody was like, oh, what happens? We just went back to the Finance Management Act, and it makes provision for delays in the tabling of money bills. Then we have the Intergovernmental Fiscal Relations Act, which establishes the kind of bodies that do the consultation on the budget, so the Minister of Finance and the 9 MECs, to facilitate consultation on financial fiscal matters, and also the Budget Forum, which is also with organized local government. And so that sets out within the Public Finance Management Act and the Intergovernmental Fiscal Relations Act, kind of who are the players in the rollout of the budget process, and also the timing and also the public participation moments as well. And then at Parliament level, we have what's called the Money Bills Amendment Procedure and Related Matters Act. I always get it mangled, I always say it wrong. And what this does is it allows for the amendment of money bills before Parliament and for norms and standards for amending money bills before provincial legislatures and related matters. And it sets out how because the Constitution sets out that Parliament should have a procedure to amend the money bills. This Act allows for that. And it also allows for the establishment of a parliamentary budget office, which we have, which is then meant to advise Parliament on alternative budget policy platforms as opposed to what is tabled by the executive. And so we are now, this bill may become very, very, very important depending on how the Government of National Unity finds its feet in tabling the money bills next week. So, but it is important to remember that Parliament hasn't really, aside for 1 or 2 comments here or there, they've never actually amended the budget. And they say under a Westminster model of like ours, that it's highly unlikely that that would happen. But we haven't had a Government of National Unity. So it's up in the air about how this budget will get passed And so let's play, I would encourage everybody to read up about the Money Bills Amendment Procedure and Related Matters Act. It might become relevant come next week. So, as I mentioned, the government budget has policy goals around distribution of wealth, stabilization of the economy, and ensuring the effective allocation of resources. And we want to have sustainability. So we want to make sure that it's sustainable in terms of debt. We often talk about it in terms of making sure that we can afford our debt and we can pay our debt and manage it. But we also want it to be sustainable in terms of an environment and climate change. So there's a double kind of meaning there. And there we want to see a kind of economic growth that is also sustainable and allows for productivity and greater wealth accumulation and greater GDP per capita. So we want to see that increasing. And so that is the relationship, and the purpose of the budget is to affect and can affect economic growth. But there's huge debate about whether it is government's responsibility. If you listen to the DA and some of the political parties, they will say, no, it's actually the private sector's responsibility to drive economic growth, and government must just step out of the way and allow that to happen, where others will argue, no, it is the role of the government to ensure that public services and public goods, being access to water, energy, education, health, public transport, those kinds of things, are governed by the state and provided by the state, and policing and defense, obviously. So this is just a little diagram showing sort of how it all fits together in terms of the flow, or how this cycle happens in terms of what we're interested in. And there at the top is always the impact of government spending. And usually in economic keys, we talk about aggregate demand. So is there enough demand in the economy to be able to allow for economic growth, for engagements? And what do I mean by demand? Basically, having money in your pocket to be able to go and purchase and engage in the economy, or run a small business or a big business, or whatever it might be. And so we talk about expenditure multipliers, and RECEP has done some excellent work on this. So I'm not going to repeat that. But the most important thing is that the impact of government spending, so wages, buying goods and services, has a multiplier effect. So 1 rand spent by government can end up, being 1.5 rands in the economy, because it allows for growth and productivity and capital accumulation. Yeah. And then, of course, not to forget that borrowing is also a mechanism for raising resources in order to feed into this loop and make sure that we have a nice feedback loop around economic growth and development. Now, some would argue that should I be talking about economic growth, or should I be talking about post-growth? So this is also up for debate. But I think given our developmental needs in South Africa, and given the high levels of energy poverty, hunger, I think we still need to talk about economic growth. But we can do so in terms of well-being, and not necessarily just a kind of crude understanding. We want to see everybody do well in the South African economy, as opposed to just some. So you should be careful when you hear just growth, 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 because we could have growth and rising inequality, which has happened in some countries. And what we want to see is growth and lowering of inequality. So the big thing that is tabled, that was not tabled, but is tabled, is the fiscal framework, which is the budget in non-legal economies. And as mentioned, now this is outdated because it doesn't necessarily happen in February, as we've seen. Now it's happening in March. But what will happen is that the framework set out for the specific financial year that gives effect to the national executive's macroeconomic policy. So that's that big picture that I've been talking about. And it tells us about estimates of all revenue, so that's tax options and borrowing, budget and extra budgetary specified separately, and expected to be erased during the financial year. So the big stink was in the non-budget was that one of the estimates of all revenue was going to be an increase in VAT. Then it tells you estimates of all expenditure, so how big we think the budget will be, and then how much we're going to borrow. So we have one of the most transparent budgets in the world. We're usually in the top 3 for transparency and availability of budget documents. But where we score poorly on the Open Budget Index is on participation. So we still need to work more on the participation angle, and this non-budget is an indication of that. Then the last area is around the contingency reserve, which is being made use of more and more. And this is meant to be for emergency or other temporary needs, or other factors based on similar objective criteria. Where we've seen the contingency reserve being used of late is around policy uncertainty. So the social relief of distress grant has been put into the contingency reserve, and other NHI and other areas of spending that where there's uncertainty about the future of the budget. So there are some fundamentals to remember about public finance. Budgets are rigid, and we have to consider what makes them rigid. So compensation of employees, so there's contracts and responsibilities. Contracts, it could be long infrastructure projects or other kinds of contracts, pensions and social security payments, debt repayments. So these factors limit the amount of money that can be shifted in a single financial year, generally. What we saw under COVID, however, is that in an extreme shock, changes can happen rapidly and fast, like the implementation of a social relief of distress grant, which we had been told prior that that was not possible. So budgets have winners and losers, and all budgets are based on balances and political trade-offs. So remember, I said that the budget is a political exercise. What I get is what you don't get. Where should one look for this money? What trade-offs would need to be made to resolve your problem? What are the political costs that would result from the change in the budget you want? And so we're always having to grapple with how we can balance the books and make sure that everybody benefits in a way. But also we must be cognizant of the fact that under austerity budgeting, which I'm going to speak to shortly, it places undue pressure on social services and pits social services against each other, which should not happen. So what is austerity? What is fiscal consolidation? So fiscal consolidation is just the term that our Treasury has been using. And generally it's agreed that it's a form of, it is austerity budgeting. And it's the adjustment or constriction measure of spending, and as I've said, more commonly referred to as austerity measures. And it's defined as illegal or policy changes which aim to lower public expenditure and tame growing sovereign debt burdens. So that should be very familiar to you. That's what we've been told. And there was a ramp up in, some people would say we've had austerity budgeting since 2000. Others will say, no, we can point to it from 2012. And so I've kind of, in my work and research, have focused on the 2012 timeframe because that's where Treasury starts talking in very plain language about fiscal consolidation. So the nature and mix of fiscal consolidation policies vary from one country to another. And the four most common fiscal consolidation measures, and you can see whether you recognize them: public expenditure cuts, regressive tax changes, labor market reforms, and pension reforms. Now, it's important for me to say that not all fiscal restrictions are inherently harmful. For example, cutting truly wasteful public spending can provide much needed revenue for social services. So, we're not against streamlining, getting rid of dead wood, so it's not that we expect the budget to expand and, just allow for programs that are not really delivering anything to continue. No, we do want to see expenditure cuts where they are relevant and necessary. So in terms of South Africa's path, our main path since 2012 has been through expenditure cuts. But we saw what was tabled for the kind of, in 2018, we saw a 1% VAT increase. And then we saw this potential 2 percentage point increase. Now, those are regressive tax changes. And so we've seen that in South Africa now. Labor market reforms, there's constant talk about how to reform the public sector wage bill, allowing for early retirement. So we can tick that box as well, but also broader labor market reforms are being discussed. Pension reforms, one could argue the two-part system, which undermines longer-term savings for workers. It meets an immediate need for poor workers, absolutely, but in the long term, it might result in workers not having enough savings for their retirement. And so that is a reform that one has to be wary of and make sure that we are kind of judging them. Now, we can assess austerity in terms of a four-step framework, and that is whether the fiscal consolidation measures have a legitimate aim of realizing people's human rights. Are they the most effective and suitable means toward that end? Are the measures pursued the least restrictive to human rights? And are other fiscal alternatives available? And considering the context and weighing the human rights costs and benefits, is the government complying with its human rights duties when adopting fiscal consolidation measures? So we can see that if we were to ask these questions of the VAT increase, it wouldn't necessarily meet outcomes, policy efforts, resources, or assessment in this framework. And so it's important for us to constantly think when we're hearing cuts, it's important for us to come back to the main aim of the budget, which is the people's budget, but should be to rectify the kinds of needs in the society that need to be met through state spending. So the key problem of austerity is the limited role for the government. So the policies of the state prioritize the wealthy and big corporations and protect private property, and the privatization of public goods, making people pay for essential services such as healthcare, education, water, and public transport. And it's unwilling to adequately address systemic crises such as climate change, economic instability, and so forth. So we've seen that it limits the ability of the state to deliver goods. It leads to the privatization of public goods. And I've just been doing some work on policing. And the interesting thing is that there are now more private security personnel than they are police. So that tells you that we have pretty much privatized our security and often well-off neighborhoods and leaving a poorly funded police service with poor resources, for example. There are many other examples. So what does the research tell us about austerity? So the budget gives concrete numerical form to policy goals, as I've mentioned. So, and we can see whether or not a policy goal is actually being implemented when we look at the allocations. And it shows citizens the choices government is making about investments and the provisions of services. So, and it enables government departments to plan to use these resources, not to use these resources. Sorry, that's not written up properly, but it affects how government departments plan to use these resources. So the spending choices and how they are financed, so tax, the way tax happens, our revenue raising and borrowing, have direct consequences for the welfare of citizens and the distribution of income. So policy priorities in health, for example, or here we're talking about early childhood development. It all tells us, it has a direct impact on the per child spend that government is allocating. Austerity's social and economic effects intersect with deepening political inequalities. So we saw coming out of the 2008 global financial crisis, when the European countries were hit hard and then went into austerity, and mainly Greece, Spain, Italy, Portugal, that it led to deepening political inequalities and also caused social problems. Austerity also induces severe economic costs through lowering GDP, employment, private investment, and wages. So some authors have said there's something quite crazy about austerity budgeting. Why has this continued when there's even by their own account, it doesn't deliver on that economic growth that they're saying they're going to do? So austerity-driven recessions amplify the political costs of economic downturn. And so it is no wonder that we have seen stagnating GDP in South Africa since 2012. There is an element of shifts and changes in the global economy because we are, open economy. But essentially, one could argue that the 2012 decision has had an impact. Research conducted in 25 European countries covering the period of 1919 to 2008 show a clear link between the magnitude of expenditure cutbacks and increases in social unrest. And we've experienced it ourselves in South Africa with the Durban riots, that there can be unrest. The implementation of austerity in Greece saw cases of HIV infection increase by 52% when the government cut its budget for needle exchange programs. So again, it has real life effects. And even the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, found that programs implementing fiscal consolidation did so in ways that disproportionately burden people on low incomes. So why? Why are we implementing austerity when it seems like it's not a good thing to do? Well, it's a good thing for really, really wealthy people. That's the answer. So I want to go to now critical issues very briefly in relation to Budget 2025. So I don't have to tell you the picture we're focused on. So I pulled out some interesting stats. We've got there are nearly 7 million children aged 0 to 5 years old in South Africa. And nearly 2/3 of those children live in the poorest 40% of households. And so I can go on. I'm not going to go into this. But the important thing is we want to address this picture, right? We want to see programs and projects that address the needs of children and the options available to us for financing that. One of the good things about the non-budget is that it was very honest in the spending pressures that government is facing. So we see the COVID-19 SRD grant, we've got healthcare frontline service shortfalls, the public sector wage agreement, education compensation for shortfalls, with all the stories of not, having to not hire teachers or and then the presidential employment stimulus and so forth. And we have early childhood development and the defense compensation shortfall. So all of these things puts pressure. And so we saw that in the allocations that there was an effort to increase these allocations. But it's important to say that these were provisional allocations and technical adjustments in the non-budget review. So it is not clear that they were actually even going to be allocating this money, because the departments had to verify that they were going to spend. But the most important thing for the increase for ECD was that for the first year, 10 billion to increase the grant value from 17 Rand to 24 Rand per child per day. And that is a real win. That was a win to see that we need to expand access and that there was a recognition. So that was on the table. And so we hope that that stays on the table for the new budget. But when we look at the principles for the budget from the 2025 medium-term expenditure framework, we see that they talk about tight fiscal environment. They say, in light of this, the total spending envelope will be maintained. No additions will be made to the overall envelope. And the compensation ceilings for provincial departments within existing limits imply trade-offs between the unit cost of labor and the total size of the staff establishment. So what essentially this tells you, the devil is always in the detail, is that what was tabled was an austerity budget. What was happening is that there was movement of and we haven't done the full numbers because we know from the 2024 budget, but basically taking from one line ministry to another rather than expanding services despite the expanding need. So as we say, it's simple. The arithmetic around spending on debt services plus tax revenue and new borrowing. But the February 19th budget proposal claimed that if government sticks to the harsh austerity set out in the medium-term budget policy statement and the MTF that I've just showed you, that national debt would stabilize, which is the aim. But I've just given you evidence from research that this doesn't happen under austerity. We do not see debt stabilization in other countries why would it happen here? And so they did accommodate for, as I mentioned, the extra spending pressures, but they didn't look at new borrowing to finance the spend. They looked at tax, and the tax that they looked at was the VAT hike. And so the question is, was this the best mechanism to deal with the funding pressures that they highlighted? So we've seen that core spending and revenue as share of GDP. So that point about one of the problems around austerity budgeting is that it is a small state, is that we see a lowering of core spending. So this graph shows you in the green line that it's as a share of GDP, it's going down, which is the cuts. And this is the research from the Public Economy Project and Michael's work.
Thoko, sorry to be the person. 5 minutes.
Perfect. I'm right on time. So government has reduced real spending per capita over the last 5 years, and it has seen the largest expenditure reduction in South Africa's democratic history. So this is absolutely critical for us. So when we're walking down the road and we're wondering why there are potholes or why our children are stunted, why our health facilities are not repaired after fire, or whatever it might be, that their children still using pit latrine toilets. And it's really because we have been reducing the size of the state in the economy. And we've already seen that the budget continues this austerity by aiming to reduce expenditures per person a further 3.5%, or nearly 1,000 rand per South African. So if there's anything that you take away from today's conversation, I want you to understand that we are reducing the size of the state and its role in the economy, and assuming that the private sector will come to the party and deliver us better services, or whatever it might be. And that's not clear that will happen. Despite news reports, the salary bill has been contained and has actually fallen in real terms. And even with the new agreement, we see that there's still pressure on the bill. And we don't see, and one of the mechanisms that Treasury has tried to implement over the years, it's not new, is this early retirement but it's not clear how this early retirement will work in terms of protecting real services. The other area in which we've seen cuts, which is important for you, is around the support to non-governmental organizations as well, which I want to flag that as well. But it's important for us to realize that we are not budgeting for a public service. We are cutting back and we are underfunding the wage bill. Another area where we've seen, although the president has said that this is now going to be another priority, a new priority area that they're going to prioritize, is around capital expenditure. But we haven't seen that to date, that there's been any real increase in capital in the budget, in the government budget for capital. So there's these kind of very complex private-public partnerships, blended finance, it's all so there's 1 trillion that's being thrown around, but it's not clear how much of that is real money or not. But we've seen that the real cut has been to national departments' capital spending, so that's the blue line has really taken a hit, and that we see provincial infrastructure has also taken a hit. So this is all, the kind of maintenance, maintaining buildings, building new buildings, and so forth, which in the literature is meant to have a good impact on, economic activity, its jobs. So infrastructure is meant to be kind of the gold standard for raising economic growth. And so the president, in his State of the Nation address, did mention that they are prioritizing it, and Treasury did mention that they get a good multiplier effect on construction. But we could argue that there are different types of infrastructure, and that jobs, people, should be seen as infrastructure and not as an expense. So we commissioned some research by two feminist economists at the University of Greenwich, and we asked them, what would it look like if we actually, instead of, we can see that we're in a slump, we can see that our needs are great, and we want to deliver services for children, for example, when is the right time for austerity? And so we go back to an old economist, Keynes, who said the boom, not the slump, is the right time for austerity. And so if we're in a slump, this is not the right time for austerity. And we are in a slump. We're not going to have, we don't have good growth rates. And we have unmet need. So it's not as if we don't have an economy that can absorb an injection from the state. So, but we said we wanted to see investment in care. So looking at education, childcare, health, social welfare, green economy, so renewables, and then public infrastructure, looking at, again, education, health, public transport, and so forth. And their research showed, and this was just a back of the envelope calculation, so they didn't do major complicated, which they could have done. They just said just a 1% of yearly investment as a ratio of gross domestic product in the care economy for 5 years could increase our growth by 6.9% and total employment by 8.8% over a 5-year period. So it's clear from their research that we're not seeking out the real opportunities for growth in our economy. And one of the drivers of that growth is education and early childhood education, and for jobs, as much of the work that Ilifa has been doing. So education and health and social development, and I'm talking about social protection, but also social welfare, so social workers, all the auxiliary, because that's been undermined. Our NGOs, NPOs, and childcare are at the core of a care economy. And so we need to have our economy seen as a care economy, care growth economy would be a good way of seeing it, as well as a green economy. And so investing in renewable energy, energy efficiency, public transport, and public infrastructure in feminist economics refers to gross fixed capital formation, so building buildings, but also sees investments in long-term assets like education, like health, like clinics, like roads and equipment that will help to improve resources. So investing in care and the green economy and infrastructure will be mostly self-financing. So it wouldn't need us to borrow heavily and go, it would generate revenues through job creation, through stimulus, plus the long-term investments in education itself. It's a no-brainer. But again, remember, budgets are about winners and losers. So in this proposal, you can ask me, Thoko, who's going to lose? And unfortunately, it does require a net, it requires people who are very, very, very wealthy, the high net wealth individuals and corporations and companies to come to the table and pay tax. Because what we've done is we've reduced the size of the state and then we've borrowed from the private sector as opposed to taxing them. So our debt is actually a foregone tax. So it's important to remember the politics of debt and who benefits through that. And so this proposal really hits at the heart of capital. And there I leave it.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Thoko, for that comprehensive and crash course on public finance and budgeting broadly. I think it was important to sort of set the scene and give us detailed context on what we are working with and what to look out for come next week, Wednesday. And it's very, I learned a couple of new things as well as you were speaking. We've got a couple of questions to engage with before we go, but obviously the conversation doesn't also end here. There are lots of, it's the hot topic for the season with the budget coming up next week as well, and what that could mean for ECD sector and other social spending or other things that concern people in this gathering or broadly. So it's a very apt conversation. It's coming at the right time. I suppose, and folks, we are opening it up for questions, comment, provocations. We've got a couple in the Q&A tab that perhaps we can engage with Toko. So I think these ones are also alluding to aspects of what can we do? So budget advocacy sort of plans or suggestion maybe. And Russell is saying that, I mean, the now withdrawn budget was looking very good for ECD in terms of increases in real term increase in spending. And what does all of this mean? Come 12th of March, when if this doesn't pan out or if we see a cut in it, what kind of approach should we adopt to expedite ECD funding? What are some of the suggestions or ideas that we have to make sure that ECD doesn't experience any funding cuts, and in fact we get the needed investments to be able to expedite access and improve quality in the sector, is what Russell is alluding to. Any ideas?
Sure, thanks, Russell. I mean, it's a tough question, because I think it speaks to the fact that, like you're saying, we're coming off a low base when we're even talking about that increase. So we almost get caught in this trap with Treasury where we're thanking them for something that should have been done 15 years, 20 years ago. Now we're sort of scrambling to just get the crumbs in order to keep services going. So I think we need to change tack. We need to definitely, and this speaks to the point about tackling austerity as a concept for South Africa as totally inappropriate, and the economics of it and is clear that it will not deliver what Treasury is saying. It will deliver more inequality and greater instability. And I think what we need to focus on is the instability question. So I was chatting to somebody the other day, my position on the non-budget was that they should have just tabled it and let it go for participation. And then this person said, no, there might have been riots in the streets the next day, like Kenya. And so that's what we need to be aware of, is that this has real, social, I mean, I don't know if that's the case, but, we saw in Kenya that there is a concentration on fiscal policy and that it can bring people to the streets. The ideal system would be to try and get people in the streets now ahead of the budget next week, to say we want a people's budget. So we want a budget that responds to the needs of the people in ways that doesn't mean that we are gutting the public sector, which is essentially what we're doing, and forcing more and more households to have to seek private access to services, or not receiving the service at all, which we see with the reports on energy poverty or childhood hunger. These are real failures on the part of the state to deliver. And then I think, the argument should be around social stability, social cohesion, going back to what the Constitution says in terms of the rights-based kind of ideals of recognizing the dignity of everybody, and making sure that we align. We have, unfortunately, our Treasury is extremely orthodox, and that's a polite way of saying that they're neoliberal. And so they don't see a role for public services and public good. They see the role as their role as making sure that the private sector gets what it wants, where it wants, how it wants it. And we see that just increases inequality. So we need to push back. There are many countries like Brazil, like Colombia. We have many examples of countries doing very innovative work around extending their economic thinking beyond just growth in the sense of allowing the private sector to extract resources without ensuring that they pay their fair share.
I hear you, Toko, and perhaps to create a balance, we don't want to be a prophetess of doom and gloom. So what would be your proposed revenue generating mechanisms for this budget that we are coming? So if you had to be part of the panel of experts to rethink and reshape the budget, what are some of the proposed revenue generating mechanism? Because we don't want to be people who always point at problems and not have solutions. So what are some of the ideas?
So this is where I diverge a little bit from my colleagues, and I'm going to steal from the Institute for Economic Justice and the Alternative Information Development Center, who have done some incredible work on putting together a spreadsheet. And already today in the newspaper, there was a talk about a holiday payment for the government employee pension fund. We do not lack for ideas of how to redistribute resources in this country, and we do not lack money. It's not a money problem. It's a redistribution problem. And the problem is the people who have the power are the ones who don't want to see the redistribution. They don't want to be taxed. But we can use the power of the states and popular support. So a report came out. There was an opinion piece that came out today looking at public ideas around taxation. And it showed that people don't mind paying tax as long as the tax is used for its right purpose. But when you're gutting a system, it becomes harder to see that it can't deliver the services, and so you think it can't deliver the services, so you don't want to pay the tax, rather than saying let's save our public services and save our public servants. It's absolutely So practically, because I can go on a whole hobby horse there. So there's some interesting things about removing the retirement fund tax break for those earning above 500,000 or 750, whatever you choose. My colleagues at the Southern Center for Inequality did a net wealth tax that could be levied at graded from 3 to 7%, would raise about 70 to 160 billion rand. I can pick restoring the corporate income tax, which was dropped by 1 percentage point at a time when we were supposedly needing money. It didn't make sense, and it was going to stimulate growth. We haven't seen that. So if it didn't do what it was supposed to do, let's just get it back up to 28%, and that would raise about 12 billion. Then the IEJ has an innovative suggestion of implementing a sliding scale social security tax of 64, would raise 64 billion, instituted luxury tax. So we mustn't get caught in let's stop ministers from driving cars or whatever. That's all nice, but we have to talk about billions, not millions. And so there are some very innovative, and I would really recommend that you look at the work done by the Alternative Information Development Center and the IEJ on where those alternative sources of income. My colleagues have said it should be a mix of these kinds of things with a 1% VAT increase. I'm not in agreement with a VAT increase at all. I don't think it's necessary. I've been convinced that given hunger, given the cost of living, that should be a last resort. And I don't think we're at a last resort just yet.
I suppose we could be discussing this for the longest time, and perhaps we need another session later on during the October budget to unpack some of these things. So last question, and I don't know if you can give us some insight. So who bears the burden of a subsidy model for funding of ECD or funding social expenses broadly? So that specific way of funding social services, the subsidy model, who are the winners and victims essentially?
So I'm quite new to this, so I'm sure there's more experts on it. And I think the dynamic is we want, and this is where I show my true political colors, because for me, remember, the budget is political. And so I think education at all levels should be free. There should be no fees paid. So if you are subsidizing with the idea that there'll be cross-subsidization, then it's the poor families who are bearing the burden. And if you're not fully funding the provision of that service, for me, the burden is on the poorer households. And so if you want some kind of sharing for, investment in the service, or there's some, maybe there's research done that it makes sense for families to have some kind of an allocation. And, my kids' school, we had to, help with fundraising all the time, So there might be good literature on that, and that I just don't know. But generally, if the state is not, for me, a public service should be free. And so it should be fully funded, and we shouldn't be talking about subsidies. And I say that to provisioning for NPOs. So I am making a distinction that it doesn't have to be a government service necessarily. It can be one that is delivered by an NPO. But what is given to that NPO should be enable them to deliver that service and not have to cross-subsidize, in terms of poor households. But I'm not an expert,
right.
so I'm sure there's more research.
Well noted. This has been very interesting. Perhaps one last thing from you before you go. Do you think, or to what extent do you think reducing fruitless and wasteful expenditure or irregular expenditure will increase available budgets to cover some of the shortfalls that are likely to happen once the VAT story or is removed from the table? Last.
So no, I mean, often I get asked this question around, it's also a veiled question around corruption, essentially. And corruption is a problem, and waste is a problem, and we do lose resources through corruption and waste and maladministration. The problem is, and I always use this example, when you're gutting a system where there were 12 people and now there are 3, right? Checks and balances fall away. And so it becomes harder. When we talk about infrastructure spending, it becomes even more complicated because it's harder to spend because you don't have the checks and balances. You don't have enough money. So you've been given some money, but inflation has come in. It's going to cost you more. So you can't spend what little you have to deliver that clinic. Do you understand? You're locked into the price of what it costs to build a clinic. So you're not going to spend that money because you don't have enough to cover the cost of the clinic. So it becomes a bit of a self-defeating vicious cycle. So we need to tackle both. We need to tackle both corruption, maladministration, wastage, and everything. But that's not an excuse for not funding services. It's not an excuse for not increasing allocations to ECD, for example. It's something that it's both and. So it's often set up either or, and I'm of the opinion that it's both and. So we need to tackle that. And we need to resource, because I worked for a little organization where there was a chartered accountant for like 8 of us. And then you have, minuscule amount of money. And then you have the Department of Health in the Eastern Cape with, billions, but only one chartered. I mean, it becomes absurd. But we don't want to pay for people to have jobs in the public sector, which is madness. Yeah.
Well said. Okay, thank you so much, colleagues. This is all we have time for. There are a lot of questions, but I don't think the conversation should end here. From what we have learned, and if I could borrow from the words of Jay-Z, we've got 99 problems. And in my opinion, money can solve a whole lot of the issues or the problems that we have. So I think it's a call to action. We need to put pressure. We need to get the voices out there. We need to put ECD back onto the national agenda. Tweet, put it on your LinkedIn, your Facebook, send a raven, send a letter, talk to your local government, whatever it takes to make sure that come March 12, the ECD budget is not touched and that children's rights are protected. Thank you so much, Thoko, for sharing your insights. Colleagues, thank you for joining us this morning. The presentation and the related research that Thoko has been citing will be shared, will be emailed to you. You can also find it on our LinkedIn at Ilifa Labantwana. And we hope to see you next month, 2nd of April, for yet another engaging conversation and unpacking a different issue that the sector is facing. Have a good day, colleagues. Goodbye.
Thank you so much. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.